One of the most common points I hear from Christians is, well, you say that, Jesus, there's not sufficient evidence, historical evidence, to support either the existence of Jesus or that he was crucified or resurrected, etc., etc. And, well, it's the same for Caesar, or it's the same for Alexander the Great, or some other historical figure who only started to appear in records maybe, say, 50 years after the death. Now, it's funny how they always seem to miss the point that neither Caesar nor Alexander the Great were credited with rising from the dead. This is the real crux. This is the real difference in the example. Of course, we've got plenty of evidence that both Caesar and Alexander the Great existed. Far more, of course, than that Jesus existed. Let's have a listen to John, who's calling on the After Dark show, and he actually is going to use Socrates. Let's see what he's got to say about Socrates.
Do you have anything useful to offer us, like evidence for God?
Well, I know that the atheists are always asking for a burden of proof. Now, when we look back in ancient history, there's not too many things that can be proven directly.
I don't know why you're going on about this. So when you talk about the atheists, it's just me and Eric here. And you're saying that you have an opinion on everything, and you didn't even know it was possible to not have an opinion on something. And so I just asked you if there's evidence you can present for God. And what I got was, if you look back in ancient history, blah, 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 blah. Do you have a way to demonstrate that there, John, do you have?
Well, I think maybe it might have been a good idea to push back on that a little bit and say, well, maybe we can't have absolute certainty, but we've got historical records, we've got evidence, we've got archaeological evidence, we've got Roman coins, for example, with Caesar's head on them, and we've got writings, and we can have a high level of confidence in a lot of these historical claims, and that's why Caesar is taught in history faculties in universities, but Jesus isn't.
A way to demonstrate that a God exists.
Well, can I give you an example?
Example of what?
Well, I used to attend university, and I noticed that in university, the professors have an opinion that Socrates
Yeah, he was probably the janitor.
existed and that he taught the Socratic method. Now, do we have proof that Socrates existed?
It doesn't. I don't know. I don't care. It doesn't matter. I'm asking about, do you have evidence that God existed?
I think Matt probably is aware that there's not really strong evidence for the existence of Socrates. Everything that we seem to know about Socrates came from Plato, and it may well be that so there's not really incredibly strong evidence that Socrates existed. We haven't got any of his writings. All we've got is these dialogues that Plato may well have completely invented. Socrates may well be a completely invented character. So I think that Matt could have actually said something about that and then gone on to say, well, but nobody's claiming that Socrates is the son of God. I don't have to believe in Socrates in order to attain to eternal life. He wasn't credited with any miracles or rising from the dead, so it's a completely different case.
Why would they teach that at university?
So when they teach things at university, they teach based on the best available evidence and the best models. Usually, at universities, do they teach that God exists?
Brilliant. I absolutely love that. I love that question. It absolutely hits a nail on the head. And I think that the next one is, do they teach that the resurrection as a fact, or do they teach the resurrection in history departments? Because if the resurrection had happened, if there was historical evidence to support it, as Matt said, it would be the single most important event in human history. And yet you go into a history faculty and you won't find anything about Jesus at all. You have to go to New Testament Studies, Department of Theology.
No, but they teach
No.
Socrates.
Curiously, even the example that you came up with.
Well, actually, no. Well, okay, yeah. Sorry. They don't teach Socrates, of course, in history departments. They they teach him in the philosophy department, but not that they don't teach that Socrates existed. They teach Socrates' method, his philosophy, etc.
Which doesn't matter because whether Socrates lived or not doesn't matter, is already different than the God one. So I'll get back to my original question that I've asked you before, John, which is, do you have a way to demonstrate that God exists?
Why doesn't Socrates matter if they teach him?
John, I asked you a question. Are you going to answer?
I think that I think Matt could answer that one and not insist. Okay.
Answer my question. No, John, I asked you a question. Are you going to answer my question?
I'm asking you why they teach Socrates.
John, I asked you a question. Are you going to answer my question?
Not until you answer mine.
John, I asked you a question.
Yeah, they teach the philosophy of Socrates. They don't teach anything about Socrates, his life, whether he had children, whether he was married, and all these other things. They don't teach that he performed miracles or did anything in particular. All they do is teach in the philosophy department what his philosophy was. They don't teach anything else. And Socrates doesn't matter in this context because Socrates is not a good parallel to Jesus, who it's claimed resurrected and performed miracles and is the Son of God. Nobody is making anything remotely like those claims about Socrates. And people aren't even really making claims that Socrates existed.
Are you going to answer my question? Who do you think is going to fucking win? This is my show.
Well, it depends on how you answer.
It doesn't depend on anything. It depends on nothing. I'm always going to win. This is my show. So when I asked you, John, do you have a way to demonstrate that God exists? That's a yes or no question, and we're not moving forward until you answer yes or no.
I have the same amount of evidence.
Okay, yeah. So I think a good question at this point would be, okay, he's made the claim, he's got the same amount of evidence that God exists as he has that Socrates exists. My question would then be, what is that evidence that God exists?
John, do you have a way to demonstrate that God exists, yes or no?
The same as Socrates.
John, do you have a way to demonstrate that God exists, yes or no?
The same as I do for
John,
Socrates.
do you have a way to demonstrate that God exists, yes or no?
The same as I do for
John,
Socrates.
do you have a way to demonstrate that God exists, yes or no?
The same as I do for Socrates.
No, goodbye.
Yeah, it's a shame. Why doesn't Matt just say, okay, what is that evidence that you've got the same as for the existence of Socrates? What is it? Yeah, obviously we didn't get to find out what evidence he does have for the existence of God because the call ended. Now, I think it could have been made clear to him that the two claims, Socrates existed and that God exists, are of a different order, simply because on the one hand we've simply got a human being who is reputed to be a philosopher, quite a mundane thing really, quite mundane. We've had countless human beings who've been philosophers who have existed. It's not really a remarkable thing. And then we've got another claim that there's an all-powerful God, an omniscient God, omnipresent, the God of the omnis. And of course, the more that a being can do, or the more that a claimed entity can do, particularly one that's supposedly outside of the material world can do, the greater the evidence is going to have to be provided to substantiate the claim. So I'm not really going to need too much evidence to accept the claim that Socrates existed, and the stakes on whether Socrates existed or not are actually minuscule. In my own case, the existence, whether Socrates existed or not, is not going to have any impact on my life. But if there's a God, then that could certainly have an impact on my life, either my afterlife or my life as I'm living it at the moment, because if there's a religion that I'm supposed to be following and worshipping this God that could improve my life, then I should certainly have evidence that there is a God. The stakes are much higher, and it's a different order of claim. This is something which really neither Matt nor Eric made plain to the caller. And I think that the call could have gone better had this actually been pointed out. It wasn't really pointed out, which quite surprised me. Eric went on to talk about the fact that when John called in, he asked whether circumstantial evidence was something which could count. And Eric said, well, in a court of law, it's not considered to be strong evidence, it's indirect evidence, etc. And I think that maybe that John was going to say, well, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence for the existence of God. Unfortunately, we never got to know what circumstantial evidence he is talking about. Unfortunately, I don't know what he would have said. I can't speculate on it, but I would like to have known so that the host could have tackled it. And unfortunately, John went away believing that he'd scored a point. Matt wouldn't answer the question, and he wasn't prepared to answer the question already. And to him, that validates his belief in the existence of God. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Let me know what your comments are on that. Bye for now.